Much for having me. Am I coming through okay, Bronwyn?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, so it's my pleasure and honor to speak to you tonight about tree ring dating, dendrochronology, tree time, something that's absorbed my interest for pretty much my entire life. I'm showing here a picture of the cross timbers, which is the western edge of the eastern woodlands as they merge with the grasslands of the southern Great Plains here in the Wichita Mountain National Wildlife Refuge. Been working out there lately. It's just a pretty picture that I got last fall. And these puny trees are exceptionally valuable for wildlife habitat, of course, for beauty and for science, especially for the science of tree ring dating and reconstructing, past droughts and pluvials, which is what we do. And so it's really been my honor for my entire professional career to conduct this tree ring work under the auspices of the National Science Foundation, which has funded me continuously since 1979, 45 years now in various projects around the United States and Mexico, Africa, and now in the Amazon of South America. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about dendrochronology of all things today, and some of the applications. And so I have a little outline that you see here at the lower left. And so I'm going to define dendrochronology first. And when you study old trees, you learn a little bit about the history of ancient forests. And so there's the conventional history of ancient forests and the unconventional history, which is what I'm going to talk about today briefly. Then I'm going to try to explain how we do climate reconstructions. I'm leaving a lot out, mind you, but I'll show you how we can reconstruct the temporal and spatial variability of climate. And that turns out to be enormously interesting for the study of climate variability and climate change and the history of drought, and what's driving floods, that sort of thing. And then lately, we've been working in the Amazon on drought and flood extremes in the greatest river system in the world. So again, thanks very much for having me. Here's a cross section of a bald cypress tree from Blackwater River, Virginia, not too far south of Maryland. This is southeastern Virginia. And the research that I'm about to describe here was published in Science magazine in 1998, and we reached the height of our fame at the Tree Ring Lab in Fayetteville. We made the front page of the New York Times. The title of the article was The Lost Colony in Jamestown Drought. And turns out old bald cypress trees in southeastern Virginia and northeastern North Carolina indicate that there was a drought in 1587. The worst drought in 800 years. Maybe you can see my little cursor right here. Here's 1580, 81, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 1590, 1600, 1610, etc. But you can see that's a skinny little ring on this one tree. Of course, we have a bunch of trees. We have hundreds of trees that show this super narrow drought exactly at the year 1587, which is of interest because that's the year Virginia Dare, the first English baby child born in the New World, disappeared from history. They had the monumental bad luck to arrive at the lost colony of Roanoke Island during the worst drought in 800 years. So say the ancient bald cypress trees. And the early days at the Jamestown colony, the first successful British settlement in the New World, were pretty bad too, including 1610, known as the starving time at the Jamestown colony. And so you see this lovely cross section of bald cypress tree rings, and you can count the rings, and we do. We count them one, two, three, four for sure. But tree ring dating is the exact dating of annual growth rings in trees to the calendar year in which they formed. It is the most accurate and precise dating method in geochronology. And so the way it works here is you look at this, and that year right there, the pith ring, the cittermost ring on this tree, which was dead, I'll have you know. This was a dead log laying on the swamp floor of Blackwater River, Virginia. So I did take the chainsaw with permission to that. I cut out a narrow slice out of the dead log. And then we brought it back to the lab and I polished it. We also took core samples out of the living trees. These are tiny pencil-sized core samples that create a wound to the living adventitious tissue of the tree, the so-called cambium, the vascular cambium. And so we make a wound about a half an inch in diameter to the living portion of the tree in order to extract a core that extends from the outer bark ring to the innermost pith ring. And so we've damaged the tree in a very small area, not unlike what sapsuckers and other woodpeckers might do. So these trees can tolerate the core sampling. We do not kill trees. Bronwyn mentioned the murdering of Prometheus, and that was, oh, that's one of the saddest tales in environmental science. And it was just a mistake made by a person that was really untrained in the method of dendrochronology, didn't even really realize, that, and had he cut the tree down not knowing it was going to be the oldest one known. The good news there, if there is any, there probably are older Bristlecone pine out in the Great Basin high elevation forests yet to be discovered. So we would say it was the oldest known at the time it was murdered. But let me emphasize, we do not, kill trees. Anyway, back to how tree ring dating works. We don't just count the rings back in time. We actually cross-synchronize the patterns of skinny rings and fat rings in their exact sequential order back in time. And that pattern, that sequence, that time history of good growth and bad growth reflects the imprint of climate. And so we begin cross-dating, which is what we call it, with our datum in time, which is the outermost ring on living trees. So you're not a dendrochronologist if you do not write the date in which the core sample was extracted on the straw into which you've placed the core until you can return it to the lab and mount it on the little core mounts and polish it and so forth. Yeah, our starting point, our datum in time is the outer ring on living trees, which here in Fayetteville, Arkansas, in April 25th, 2025 is going to be just the first formed cells for the year 2025. And that we know that date, and then we cross-match the patterns of wide and narrow rings back in time. And it works because there's only one history of growing season drought and wetness in a given climate province, and almost all of the trees share that history of climate. We also massively replicate the core samples, and we can directly calibrate the derived tree ring chronologies with climate data. We can validate it against withheld climate data or historical information. I mean, the trees are kind of integrating pluviometers, rain gauges, that is. They kind of integrate the growing season moisture balance in the width of the ring. We don't cut the trees. So I beat that one pretty bad. Can you still hear me, Bronwyn? Am I still there
Yep.
or am I?
No, 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 I can
Sorry.
still hear you. Yep,
This
you're
is
still good.
so weird. All I see is my screen in the living room here. I'm talking into the screen, but that's the world we live in these days. A little bit more about why tree rings. Well, dating, reasons, climate, environment, conservation. Again, tree ring dating is the most accurate and precise dating method in geochronology. Exact calendar year dating, no plus or minus when it's done right. We date archaeological sites. We've dated, historical buildings. We've calibrated the radiocarbon dating method because it's the production rate of radiocarbon in the upper atmosphere has fluctuated over time. And we now know that, and we calibrate against the known time given to us by tree rings. So it's a slick dating method, really. Its only limitation is the age of trees. And so the longest tree ring chronologies in the world are about 10,000 years long. Prometheus is 5,000 years old. He was when he was cut down. but there's lots of bristlecone pine out in the west that are 4,000 years old. And then there's a lot of dead wood laying around in the dry forests of the Great Basin, bristlecone pine wood included, that died 2,000 years ago or 5,000 years ago. And so we can get samples from this dead wood and cross match it with the inner part of the living tree chronology due to the imprint of climate. Climate, I'll have you know, when you have a sequence of at least 100 years or so, the history of climate is unique and non-repetitive. We wish it were not. We wish it were predictable and occurred in a random cycle, a regular cycle, but it's not. It's more of a random walk. And so we can date pieces of wood to the precise climate epochs in which they lived, if I'm making any sense. And so we do. Once we build the tree ring chronologies, we do study climate. We reconstruct pre-instrumental climate variability and climate change. We do calibration and verification. We reconstruct precip temperature, the Palmer Drought Severity Index, and a host of other climate variables. We also study the environment. We reconstruct forest dynamics, past wildfires, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, floods. And I'm interested, and many of my colleagues are interested in conservation. So we core trees to determine their age to help authenticate ancient forests and help save the planet. It needs our help, for sure. So a little bit about, you know, site selection in dendroclimatology. So we look at the world a little bit differently. Um, all trees are not necessarily ideal for reconstructing past climate. There can be this environmental mediation of the climate signal in tree growth. And so I show two schematic diagrams here. One, a big, handsome ponderosa pine growing on a level site near a lake with thick soil, wicking moisture from the a water body nearby. I mean, an ideal level site with rich, nutrient-rich soil where the tree grew large and fast. And if you take a core sample from the stem, not hurting the tree, and display the tree rings, they're all about the same size. So we refer to those rings as complacent rings. If, on the other hand, we go from this level site down near the lake up to the side of the mountain, the steep mountain with thin soil underlain by rock substrata, where the tree is dependent upon soil moisture delivered by precipitation only. There is no geological source of moisture. It's totally precipitation driving soil moisture variability. If you then core that tree in that steep environment and display its rings, well, they vary from one year to the next. So these are couplets, I should say, light band, dark band, light band, dark band. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. You can see, oh yeah, they vary in width. And that ring width variability is reflecting the variation of precipitation and available soil moisture. And so it's very sensitive. These are sensitive tree rings. And so this is the kind, we look at the forest and we try to identify locations in the forest where we can maximize the climate signal. So all trees and forest types are not equally valuable for dendrochronology. We practice site selection to identify environmental conditions that maximize the climate influence on tree growth, particularly precip and temperature. And there's four things illustrated here. The complacent versus sensitive sites. I mentioned that. Size may not be equal to age. This is a much bigger tree, but he grew faster and tends to die young. This guy was growing on the side of the hill with reduced moisture, and he grew more slowly and he achieved a greater age. In fact, Edmund Schulman, who studied the bristlecone pine, uh, introduced the idea of longevity under adversity, that some of our oldest trees known on Earth grow in extremely adverse conditions. So bristlecone pine in the White Mountains of California in the rain shadow of the Sierra Nevada above Death Valley, one of the most hyper-arid forest environments in the world. And that's a very adverse site, and the trees grow painfully slowly and get incredibly old. But they're widely spaced. There's not a lot of grass on the ground. It's a desert-like environment. There's there's no fungi to speak of. There's not a lot of tree-boring insects. They can't handle the harsh conditions. Fire doesn't propagate well, so the trees tend to persist for really millennia under those conditions. And this slide also illustrates the difference between commercially valuable forests and non-commercial forests. I mean, this kind of tree, the complacent tree on the left, is an ideal site to practice silviculture, to extract forest product for the good of society, because it's a level site. You can bring in machinery, you can harvest, suitable trees. You can do that harvesting with minimal damage to the soil. You can then plant additional trees for the next generation of trees for later harvests. And so this is a silvicultural site. It's commercially valuable site. And we have thousands of square miles of commercially valuable timberlands in the United States. On the other hand, these steep, austere, stunted forest sites on the sides of mountains and steep slopes are non-commercial for timber production because, well, first of all, you'd be very damaging to go up there and cut those trees. They're steep, they'd be subject to soil erosion, and plus they grow slow. And so it'd be centuries before you get another generation of timber for harvest. So there's this difference between commercial and non-commercial forests that plays into the history of our forests in the United States. And so this is kind of the conventional forest history in the United States here. This is out of the Forest Voice. This is a famous map published in a lot of different books, kind of showing the erosion of the virgin forest from the Plymouth colony in 1620 to the mid-19th century to the early 20th and late 20th century. And you can see that the virgin forest, the eastern United States and the West had begun to erode on the eastern seaboard in the old Northwest and other portions of the country before the Civil War. And by the early 20th century, boy, we've been busy. We've been chopping down all the trees. And by the end of the 20th century, there's only the Boundary Water Canoe area, maybe up there in northeastern Minnesota, the Adirondacks, and nothing else pretty much in the eastern United States and much less in the West. So that's kind of the conventional view. And it's articulated at the Fisher Museum of Forest History at Harvard Forest in Petersham, Massachusetts. I highly recommend this museum. They have this like 30 panel diorama of forest history for central Massachusetts. These are 3 photos of it. A diorama is these are 3-dimensional models, with copper spun wire and painted trees. And I mean, it's super elaborate, beautiful thing. And it's showing the history of the landscape in central Massachusetts from the pre-settlement forest circa 1700 when it was in virgin conifer and northern hardwoods. So this was kind of quote unquote virgin. Native peoples lived here, of course, but their impact was far less than the industrial impact of modern man and woman. And so this is the pre-industrial conifer and northern hardwoods in their pristine condition. And then by the height of the dispersed rural farming agriculture in the early 19th century, it's been horizon to horizon clearing of the forests and subsistence farmsteads. And then we had the Industrial Revolution and the rural outmigration, rural abandonment. And in the wake of abandonment, we get second growth, third growth, and fourth growth forests beginning in the early 20th century. And so this is in many of the introductory ecological textbooks. Uh, and it's kind of the conventional view that we have of what happened to our virgin forests in the eastern United States. And it's very hard to rectify this view with this map, which is a map of tree ring chronologies from North America. And all of these are, so this is my unconventional forest history of North America. Each one of these locations, here's one on the Smoky Hill River in west central Kansas. You can barely call them trees, but they're junipers growing on the limestone bluffs above the Smoky Hill. And it and all of these other locations, there's usually at least 40 trees, core samples from at least 40 trees. Most of the trees are over 300 years old, and so there's 300-year-old trees. There's these oaks that go all the way from Maryland to the Trans-Pecos and beyond to the oaks of California, the bald cypress, the taxodium in black here, starting in Maryland and Delaware, going down to Florida and across the Mississippi Valley down into Mexico and into Western Guatemala. The great Sudetsuga menzies in red here, that's Douglas fir. That's the most commercially important timber species on planet Earth. It's also fabulous for tree ring dating. And so these are places where dendrochronologists like myself have gone and taken core samples from old growth forests. These are all old growth forests. And so how can we rectify this map of old growth forests with the map shown in the Forest Voice on the previous slide, showing the complete eradication of the virgin forest? Well, I think Marion Clausen had the answer in 1979 in Science magazine. He noted that in pre-settlement times in the lower 48 United States, there were 950 million acres of forest land, of which 100 million acres were, quote, non-commercial. And so a lot of these trees, especially here in the cross timbers of Oklahoma and north central Texas, they're non-commercial for timber production. They're one of our native forests. They just weren't big columnar redwood trees. And so on steep ground, they weren't worth logging. I mean, sad but true. Some of our best habitat has survived because it wasn't worth exploiting by man. But they still have important habitat value, of course. They're part and parcel of what was Native America upon settlement. And of course, they have scientific value for things like climate studies and other studies. And so many uncut ancient forests still survive all over North America and the United States and Maryland, as you probably know, including these bald cypress trees down in North Carolina, Black River, North Carolina. They're both over 2,000 years old. That dude right there is at least 2,632 years old, because we studied the living daylights out of that guy and a bunch of the others here. And so these are some of the oldest trees on Earth. But you can see that, well, they're partly hollow. They've been torn up by landfalling hurricanes in the past. A lot of their canopy's been busted off. They've got partial heart rot in places. They got wind shake, which definitely degrades the lumber value. And so even a valuable tree like bald cypress, which is a botanical cousin to redwood, even bald cypress stands can be non-commercial. And so these black symbols show you some surviving stands with centuries to millennia old bald cypress, over the southeastern United States and Mexico. And so we have gone to those places in particular, to take core samples and reconstruct environmental variability and change. So here's the record for the oldest known living trees on Earth. These are the oldest tree ring dated, sexually reproducing, non-clonal trees for each species yet found. And of course, leading the way is Great Basin bristlecone pine, Pinus longeva, 4,900, Alurce Fitzroya cupriosoides in Chile, 3,600, giant sequoia, 3,200, Sierra juniper, 2,600, Bold cypress taxodium distichum 2624. It's now 2632 because the tree's still alive and still going. And here you see the top 11 species that have the oldest known living individuals, trees. Probably they're all underestimating the longevity potential of each, but those are the records. And yes, Prometheus was a Great Basin bristlecone pine. It was not in California though. It was in Nevada in what is now Great Basin National Park, Wheeler Peak in east central Nevada. Still a magnificent national park. You must go there and check it out. There's plenty of ancient bristlecone pine and other conifers at that location. So there is a tree ring perspective on the history of our forests. And so we like them because they have incredible climate value. Here's the chronology from 605 before the Common Era to 2017. This is 2,624-year-long tree ring chronology that we derive from Black River, North Carolina. And the gray values are the mean index value for each year. I mean, there's hundreds of trees that have all been exactly dated and then processed the way we do, and then averaged together into this gray chronology. And then we have this multi-decadal smoothing in the black curve that shows you kind of this ring width index on the y-axis and year on the x-axis. So here's the year 0. We're out here in 2025, and this is negative 600 before the Common Era, right? And so, wow, that this is ring width index. So this was a period of very poor growth and a period of very abundant growth. And so we can correlate our tree ring chronology from Black River with gridded precipitation data. So we have real fine scale 4-kilometer resolution precipitation observations available from 1895 to present. We did a correlation analysis with that gridded data from 1895 to 2017 using our Black River tree ring chronology shown in the white dot right there. And we got correlations around 0.7 close in, and it decays with distance. But even that one chronology in southeastern North Carolina is correlated at least a little bit, 0.2 maybe, with Maryland, if you believe that. So that's pretty cool. That is spring rainfall for trees that grow in the water. Unbelievable. It's a long story. I won't bore you with it, but it absolutely is true. They can't keep up with the evapotranspiration demand, and they are directly and positively correlated with spring rainfall. If you take one of the grid points out of the gridded instrumental data product and correlate that one grid point with all his buddies, you're correlating instrumental climate data with instrumental climate data. And of course it's correlated 0.9 close in, and it decays with distance. But this comparison, real data on the right correlated with itself, proxy data on the left correlated with the instrumental climate data. Amazing. This is an amazing proxy. It is a valuable record for over 2,000 years of growing season rainfall, in the Carolinas. So, I mean, they're beautiful trees. They're important wildlife habitat. Swallowtail kites, wood storks have been seen in there. All kinds of, important aquatic animals are present. The Nature Conservancy has protected so much of the Black River of North Carolina, almost 20,000 acres. And believe it or not, the tree rings have helped raise money. The fact that there's 2,000-year-old trees at the Black River Preserve in North Carolina has helped the Nature Conservancy raise money to buy more land to protect more of this amazing stream, a black water stream, in a heavily developed part of the eastern United States. One of the great natural areas really left in the United States. The last photo I'll show you is another photo of that site. Anyway, here's Bronwyn said, we'd like to see what the data look like. Well, here's the raw data. Here's 2 collections. of blue oak from California. We take cores, these are mounted cores from Mount Diablo, just east of San Francisco. And these are little cross sections cut with a chainsaw from little bits of dead wood or logs laying on the forest floor. So living trees with the cores, dead wood with the cross sections. And here's another collection from the Kaweah River, flows out of the giant Sequoia National Park. And so this is one, all of these samples go into one chronology. I showed you that previous map that had 2,000 chronologies on it. So we're talking like thousands of trees are being used to do these tree ring chronologies and to reconstruct climate. So that's why we say massive replication. And the value added, all of these, if you had a microscope and you look close, you would see that, oh, there's needle marks for every decade. And we annotate the dating. And so that's the value added to dendrochronology. We've exactly dated all of this. And here's a stained thin section of blue oak, Quercus douglasii, kind of showing an enormous ring. Here's an enormous ring for their ring porous. 1577, 1578, 1579, 1581. Oop, 1580's missing. It was such a bad year. It didn't form a ring at all in that year. That's why you got to do cross dating, what we call cross dating. But this is what the data look like, the raw data. Every one of these things has a name, a number. It has an accession number, and they're in a box permanently curated at the University of Arkansas Museum, out at a really nice modern museum where some of the high dollar art for the Crystal Bridges Art Museum in Bentonville, Arkansas was stored as well, while the art museum was under construction. So these wood samples had good company, and they are protected for future scientific work. And they ought to be. They were funded by the taxpayers of the United States. We went out, with federal funding from the National Science Foundation in order to gather these important samples from nature and use them as a proxy for climate variability. And so it's pretty darn good. The records that we get from tree rings. Now we've got a lot. So we're looking at the Dust Bowl drought. This is the worst drought of the modern instrumental era, starting in 1895 to present. This was the worst decadal drought that we had in the United States, and it extended up into Canada, of course. And what we're doing is we're mapping the Palmer Drought Severity Index for 1931 to 1940, the full decade. And this is based on thermometers and rain gauges. It's the soil moisture balance. The Palmer Drought Severity Index, PDSI, that's what it is. And we have used our 2,000 tree ring chronologies to reconstruct the gridded Palmer Drought Severity Index from tree rings. So this is the tree ring reconstructed Palmer Drought Severity Index for the same 10-year period, 1931 to 1940. Amazing. I mean, amazing. Like it's great fight. We did this. I'm running out of time. So we used point by point principal components regression, which my buddy Ed developed. You see the spatial fidelity of tree ring drought versus real drought, the coast to coast dryness that you see in both cases, the real data and the reconstructed data. This was the worst drought in 350 years, so say the tree rings, right? So here is the this is just the Western United States. So the 1950s drought was worse than the 1930s drought in the West. But really, it wasn't for about 350, 400 years that a drought of greater severity occurred back in the late 16th century. So the impact of the drought and the drought itself was aggravated by poor land use and was maybe the first anthropogenic mega drought. It turns out the dust in the Dust Bowl really mattered, and it kind of provided a positive feedback on the intensity of the dryness. And we're seeing this early 21st century mega drought made mega by man because the precipitation deficit out west during the early 21st century was only garden variety deficit. It was really the very strong vapor pressure deficits that really drove this drought and made it almost equal to the 16th century mega drought, to the Great Pueblo drought that A.E. Douglas found, at the end of the Anasazi or ancestral Pueblo occupations at Mesa Verde, and then the Chaco drought at Chaco Canyon. Anyway, these are amazing. So we do these continent-wide reconstructions. We now have the North American Drought Atlas, the North American Seasonal Precipitation Atlas, the Greater Eurasian Drought Atlas. We've made a bunch of these around the world using tree rings. Now, I'm going to end with something about uh, droughts and floods on the Amazon River. And this map is interesting because this map is showing all of the holdings of the International Tree Ring Data Bank, which is housed by the NOAA Paleoclimatology Program in Boulder, Colorado. All of these tree ring chronologies have been donated or given and are publicly available through NOAA in Boulder. And a bunch of these are mine that I contributed in Mexico and Southeast. And you can see that tree ring chronologies are distinctly a mid-latitude phenomenon. There's hardly any in the tropics. So it's true to say that most trees on Earth do not form rings, tree rings, because most trees on Earth are in the tropics. Most tree species are in the tropics. And so you can see a few, so there are some cases, but the deal with tree rings is that it's the winter dormant season. When it gets so cold, trees go dormant. And then in the spring, they reinitiate physiological activity. And this is not in every case for every species, but for most species in the temperate northern and southern hemisphere, they do form anatomically distinctive annual rings. And that is absolutely not the case in most of the tropics. But there are exceptions, fortunately. And so I'm going to talk about this, about the Amazon. First, I want to say something about the biology of Amazonia. I took this photo on the Rio Xingu at the big construction site. So I'm standing in a devastated area looking at kind of a partially degraded forest. It's a pretty shot. But anyway, biology of Amazonia, 5.5 million square kilometers of tropical rainforest, the largest on Earth, the most species-rich forest ecosystem in the world, approximately 1/3 of all species on Earth, 10% of the global net primary productivity, and 10% of global terrestrial carbon storage. Get out of here. Maybe 4 billion trees, individual trees, in Amazonia alone. That's what they estimate. There are 6,727 taxonomically described tree species from the lowland Amazon. This article in PNAS 2017. There's like 800 in North America, north of Mexico. So 6,727 have been described by science, yet they think there's 16,000, meaning there's 10,000 yet to be found, are estimated to be native to Amazonia, the Tuskegee article in Science. Why? Because we find new species all the time. And in our study plots all over the Amazon, there's a bunch of tree species that are only found on that plot and nowhere else. There are many species that have a very, very local distribution of maybe 50 hectares. Unbelievable. And it's a big place. So there's definitely more to discover from nature. Now, in this blizzard of diversity, there are about 225 tree species in the lowland Amazon that are widespread and account for half of all the trees. And they are referred to as hyperdominant species, and Cedrela odorata is one of them. Here's the Amazon River. I'm hurrying. I'm going to get it done in 5 minutes. I wrote the letters big because it's a big river, largest river on Earth. Get out of here. 6 million kilometers, mean discharge, 250,000 cubic meters per second. Get out of here. It exceeds the Amazon River flow into the Atlantic exceeds the discharge of the next 6 largest rivers on Earth combined. It is 5 times larger than Ganges Brahmaputra, which is number 2 on the worldwide discharge list. It is 12 times larger than the discharge of the Mississippi River. It is 414 times the discharge of the Colorado. I mentioned that because it's a very litigious stream that everybody wants part of. Another way to think of this is the bathymetry is of the river is below sea level near Manaus. Well, Manaus is right here. So about 1,000 kilometers inland, the bed of the Amazon River is lower than sea level. What does that mean? That means that the discharge of the river is mighty enough to hold the Atlantic Ocean at bay. The river delivers 17% of the freshwater supply to the global ocean. Amazing. So there's problems that we want to address with the tree rings and these hydroclimate changes over the Amazon. And so, where's this thing? Can I grab this thing? No. Anyway, here's from a study but Jonathan Barichevich did in 2018, and it's showing the water level at Manaus and the water level at Obidos since 1901. And you see this big time annual peak. And so the flood stage and the drought stage, so the Amazon River is subject to a high stand and a low stand every year. In the wet season, it's high. In the dry season, it's low, right? And so there's this seasonal amplitude, of the river. And that's what's being illustrated here. The red part is when they started making observations at Obidos. And the black part is at the Rio Negro at Manaus. It's basically the Amazon River. And we're seeing that the amplification of the seasonal discharge cycle, or the seasonal discharge cycle, has been amplified after 1960. That means the maximum and minimum flows have become more extreme with deeper floods and more extreme droughts. And we plot here the public emergency thresholds for floods. 29 meters right there at Manaus is flood stage, and 15.8 meters is drought, public emergency drought. And you can see that, well, we're exceeding the flood stage more frequently and the drought stage. It's like damned if you do and damned if you don't. It's getting more floods and more droughts. And so these extreme floods and droughts are real, and they are being suffered by society and nature. And this is why we study tree rings. I mean, we have hypotheses, science does, for why this is happening. One is deforestation, unfortunately, that's probably part of it. Intensification of the Walker circulation, which is part of the El Nino Southern Oscillation, that seems to be happening. Anthropogenic climate change, that's certainly happening. That's no doubt contributing. And then natural variability. I mean, this is only 100-some-odd-year long record, so certainly it's not representative of a mighty river like the Amazon for, the past millennia. And so that's one reason we study tree rings, to try to get a better handle on that. So we've cored these trees. Cedrela odorata, look at these beautiful tree rings. There's 1950, 60, 70, 80, 90, 2000. We have these samples of Cedrela odorata from the eastern equatorial Amazon. This is Daniela Granada de Souza, my colleague, and we've reconstructed wet season rainfall totals. We only explained 42% of the variance, but here's the 90th. And so here's the time series, right, with the smoothing. It starts in 1772 and ends in 2016. And we highlighted some very wet years above the 90th percentile and some very dry years. And our project during COVID was to go to the Brazilian Digital Library online, something we could do online in lockdown conditions, and try to find, hey, is there any kind of historical validation for this big flood in 1859 or this one in 1818 or any of these others, or the super drought in 1865? I mean, do the newspapers show this? Do any of government reports exist that might tell us more about these events? And the answer is yes. And so here's the forgotten drought of 1865, based on, you know, it's based on both our tree rings were used to identify the event, and then Daniela went into the Brazilian Digital Library reading Portuguese and found all this other evidence in the Diário de Pernambuco in January 24, 1865, the lowest ever witnessed on the Rio Negro, or Diário de Rio de Janeiro. The steamship Icamiaba grounded twice on its September trip. Louis Agassiz, the famous professor at Harvard University, went with Silva Coutinho, his Brazilian colleague, on a theological expedition to study fish into the central Amazon in 1865. And they had a huge drought and large banks of sand and mud, even in the middle of the river where people are camped out to fish. They they went there to discover new species of freshwater fish, and they found 800 of them. In that one year, 1865, 800 new species of freshwater fish by Agassiz and Coutinho. The conditions were ideal because of the drought. It was like shooting fish in a barrel. You could just go into puddles and pick them up. 800 new species in one year. That's more than was known to Carl Linnaeus in the late 18th century in the entire world. I mean, it's just amazing the diversity of the Amazon. And lastly, you know, the Amazon flood of 1859 in this newspaper, June 7th, 1859. Oh, I didn't explain the symbols on here. I'll get to that in a second. Here it says Santarém, the Amazon flood covered all the lands and even was to harm some establishments built in lands on the mainland very high. And its invasion went to towns like Santarém, where First Street was completely impossible. And now traffic can be made by canoe. So what these are, and on the previous map, they were historical reports, and it's just a count. The number of reports, the taller the cone, the greater the number of reports. So there were a lot of reports of drought over in this sector, but wetness along the east coast of Brazil. Here's at Santarém, there's a bunch of reports of flooding, and at Manaus too. And then these are tree ring estimates at two locations, and they indicate, very wet conditions as well. And so in this case, the tree rings and the historical reports are in agreement that there was indeed huge flooding going on the Amazon River. And how deep was that? Well, when they say you could get a canoe down First Street, we went and measured the elevation of First Street. It's still there. It's 10.2 meters above sea level. The all-time record flood of 2009 was 10.22 meters above sea level. So it just came on to First Street. And if you're going to float a canoe made out of wood back then in 1859, you probably need a half meter. So we're guesstimating that, oh, maybe it was 10.7 meters. This was the record flood on the Amazon River in the modern era. This one may have exceeded it. The Amazon flood of 1859 may have been the most extreme in the recorded history of the Amazon, exceeding even recent extremes. In fact, that makes 1859 on the Amazon a candidate for the largest known meteorological flood in world history, because this is the largest river in the world. It doesn't mean that we aren't in an era of amplified hydroclimatic change in the Amazon. We certainly are, but it does mean that there have been extremes in the past, for sure, that exceed anything we see today. And so here's the last slide I promised to show you, looking down on the old trees at Black River, North Carolina. Sorry for taking so long. It's 7 o'clock now. Thank you very much.
No, thank you. You could have gone on. We're been captivated by the presentation.
Doubt it. But anyway.
If you can unshare, come back. We'll do some Q&A if you have some time.
I do. Let me see. Unshare. Well, you'd think I'd know how to do this. I can't even see my cursor. There it is.
Okay,
Sorry.
Okay. Thank you. That was amazing. Do we have any questions? Well, we do have some questions in the chat box. Some of them that you covered. So I'll just go down here. And Shireen, I think some of this you covered. You can use the dead, well-preserved logs to gather climate data.
Yes.
Older than current living trees.
Yeah, you can. Well, some wood is far too old. I mean, so if you have 500-year-old trees and the wood is, say, 400 years old, it's been laying there for 400 years, well, the rings will match. The outer 100 rings will match the inner 100 rings in that case. Now, there'll be wood that's far too old, and we can't date it with tree rings, but maybe we can date it with radiocarbon. But then there's, of course, wood that's older than radiocarbon dating itself. Radiocarbon dating only works back to about 40,000 years ago. And so we have wood from the Carolinas that's radiocarbon dead, meaning there's no radiocarbon in it, meaning it's older than 40,000 years old. But yeah, for sure, that's routine. We get logs or dead wood from the forest floor, and we use it to improve the records.
Shireen also asked that you mentioned that volcanic tree ring data can inform about volcanic activity. How is that information stored in the rings, and how do you extract the info?
Well, two ways. One is if you've ever been to Mount St. Helens, I mean, and went to the blast zone, you'll see that, oh my Lord, it's devastation. Everything was killed. And in fact, they became part of the bedload, trees became part of the bedload of the stream and are deposited in great heaps down river. And so you can date those tree rings on those logs, and you can determine the death date, and that's when the eruption occurred. You can also go along the shear line of the blast zone where the forest survived but was damaged and then calloused over the wound, and you can date the callousing. So there's a lot of different ways we can date volcanic activity if there are forests on the volcano. But as everyone knows, volcanoes, especially the cataclysmic variety, like Tambora, Krakatoa, etc., can change the global climate, can depress global temperatures for 3, 4 years afterwards, hemispherically, if not globally. And they can cause tree ring anomalies in high elevation forests or high latitude forests that have absolutely positively been correlated with these uh, global scale climate cooling effects of big cataclysmic eruptions.
Jane has a couple of questions on process. So when you core from a live tree, do you need to fill it or seal it so it doesn't get diseased or infected? And when people come from around to sample some of the oldest trees, what is the procedure? Do you take from different heights, from different sections, or is it better to core from the same general spot?
Well, we core at breast height because that's where we're most efficient, and it's close to the base of the tree. And we try to get 2 cores per tree, not for mainly to solve the dating, because sometimes rings are incomplete around the circumference of the plant, and it assists with the cross dating. Treating the wound, the great Alex Shigo was a forest pathologist with the USDA Forest Service for his entire career. Great studies, did a lot of experimental studies on all kind of forest pathologies, including damage from the increment borer. And it turns out that there are a couple of species, American beech and the white firs, that they rot easily to begin with. And if you core them, they've studied over time that the borehole tends to lead to discoloration around the borehole and incipient rot. And so, it doesn't take much for beech and white firs to suffer heart rot. And so you probably ought not be coring them if you don't have a really strong reason to do it. But 99% of the tree species on Earth can tolerate increment borer damage. Absolutely. And in fact, they've evolved the compartmentalization response. And there's nothing we can do to improve on that, actually. So no, no kind of pruning sealant or dowel rods or anything. Shigo found that the tree will immediately, when wounded, will immediately infuse the wound with resins or tannins at the cellular level, and it'll wall off those cells and then and infuse those cells. And then in subsequent growth, later in that same growing season or in the next growing season, it will callus over. The cambium will callus over the wound and close it completely if it's a vigorous growing tree. And so don't want to interfere with that wound response that Mother Nature has herself developed over time.
Fair asks, the tree ring chronologies that are held by NOAA that you mentioned, are they safe
Well, not
from?
from lunatics and not from, anarchists that want to dismantle the government. Like you just can't make this stuff up. I mean, come on. We're a rich nation and this is part of our intellectual heritage, and that you would, but yeah, it's a federally hosted website. And scientists back up their data a host of different ways. And a lot of concerned scientists have been trying to back up a lot of federal data center systems. But I'm confident we're going to grow through this particular episode, and people are going to realize that, oh, uh, science is actually brought us to where we are, and it, will take us to where we're going, and we need to protect it.
All right. And then let's see. The first tree cross section showed the droughts of Jamestown. Where were there other droughts? The old tree that was actually, is it in some museum? Is it in a museum?
Oh, are we talking about Prometheus now?
Yeah, the the first cross section you did, I think, of the bald cypress tree. Were there other droughts? Is the
Oh man.
question.
Yeah, there's lots of drought. A drought happens, right? And there's a lot of old science about, an 11-year sunspot cycle, and recurrent drought in the Great Plains. And there's definitely evidence for that. It's just, I mean, there's definitely a statistical association between drought occurrence in the Great Plains and solar lunar variability. No doubt about it. And it's statistically significant, but it does not explain very much variance. It's not good enough to be able to say, well, in 11 years, we're going to be able to, we're going to see another drought in Omaha, or Rapid City. It's just not like that. It's more of a curiosity. Turns out the sun brings us life. It drives the climate system of Earth. But there are the variability, the very small variability in solar luminosity associated with the sunspot cycle is about 1/10 of 1%. And that's just not enough. And it's mainly in the ultraviolet range, and it doesn't appear to be quite enough to imprint a major signal in the climate system of Earth in terms of variability on that cycle. I mean, it drives all of climate, but as far as pulsing climate, no, probably not. So the question is about, were there other droughts? Heck yeah, there's lots of droughts. There were lots of droughts in the southeastern Virginia, northeastern North Carolina, but 1587 was the worst of them all, so say the tree rings. And that was just, they had the monumental bad luck to arrive, you know, during the middle of that drought. And we think that they didn't die of thirst. They probably were dependent upon the native Algonquin people for trade and tribute and try to provide food. And it wasn't working out. And they probably moved off with The Lumbee tribe, I think that's a favored hypothesis, and they were kind of assimilated, the survivors, that is, maybe Virginia Dare, became assimilated amongst the native peoples and moved into the interior of North Carolina and were lost to history. But the drought that the tree rings show positively did occur and co-occur with that settlement adds a new wrinkle to the mystery. And it's just fascinating.
I mean, I want to go back to what you said with the complacent rings and the sensitive rings. If you your data is only as good if you get the right trees. Is that correct?
Well, there are some trees that are so complacent we really can't date them. That's correct. You know, if the rings are all, I mean, we can use heroic methods. We could try radiocarbon dating, but generally, no. You know, there definitely are trees that have a very weak climate signal where, they're happy. They've had all, they just, environmental variability didn't impact their growth. And so those can't really be synchronized in time the way we are sure. We can still count the rings, and it's a living tree. We can count the rings back to the center ring and probably be pretty sure that's about correct age. No problem with that. But using it to study the history of rainfall, it won't be useful for that. That's why we practice site selection. We've learned to go to places where the rainfall effect on tree growth is maximized. And so that was always dry sites on steep slopes. And then we find bald cypress and Pilgera dendron uviferum, in Chile, in the Valdivian rainforest. Both of them are swamp species. Both of them grow in water, and both of them are positively correlated with rainfall. And so it's a long story, but no doubt about it, it's not that complicated. It basically has to do with, um, you know, well, it's a long story. I won't get into it, but basically, if you've ever been to a southern swamp or a river, even in Maryland, in middle of July, in the middle of the lake with the sun beating down, that's rough, and those trees got to live through that for centuries. And so they have a hard time keeping up with the vapor pressure that the atmosphere is demanding. Anyway, sorry.
No. Then and then is Prometheus is is there a remnant of Prometheus anywhere? Or?
Yes, there are. There are several remnants. The Park Service has a remnant on display at the Visitor Center in Eastern Nevada. The University of Arizona Laboratory of Tree Ring Research has samples of it. And there's a bar uh, in town there below outside the gate to the national park that has one above the bar. So when you go have a beer, you can see it too. At least there was last time I was there. But yes, there are, and you can, if you're really healthy and know where it is, you can hike up to the stump. So the stump is still there. And that's one thing about bristlecone pine. The wood, it's a pine, and but a wood is incredibly dense and it can persist on the landscape literally for up to like 8,000 years. They have found bits of wood that have rings from 8,000 years ago.
Now, what is the Charlene wants to know, do you know what the age of angel oak in Charleston, South Carolina is?
A beautiful tree, Quercus virginiana, the great live oak. What a handsome tree. And all the genus Quercus, the loveliest trees in the world, oaks. They're my favorites. And the live oaks are evergreen, you'll note, and their rings, they don't really have annual rings. Can you believe that? I mean, they do kind of, but they got these massive rays that emanate radially from pith to bark that interrupt the rings. No one has ever, to my satisfaction, made a valid tree ring dated chronology of Quercus virginiana. And so, therefore, we cannot really use dendrochronology to answer her question. Now, I would say that it's old. I would say it's probably 300, 400 years old. I don't think they're remarkably old, you know, because oaks don't get remarkably old anywhere on Earth. Like the oldest post oak we have in this part of the world, in the cross timbers, is 450 years old. We think they live for 500 and probably 600, but they suffer heart rot so much that we can say for sure 450. Blue oak in California, we can say for sure 600. Probably it lives for 700. You know, and then you hear tales about some European oaks and so forth that are, I think they're pretty confident about the age of some of them, maybe being 800 or so. But that's it. Those are way out on the tail of the distribution. I mean, most of them are 2 to 400 years old, if that. And I think that would be true for Quercus virginiana as well. That in no way, the fact that it's not as old as Prometheus in no way detracts from its beauty, of course. They're both beautiful.
Uh, Someone is interested to know a little bit of the history of your lab and how long you've been at the University of Arkansas.
Well, I went there in 1975 to study archaeology and tree rings. Of course, that was been my specialty. And I got a master's there, and I made the tree ring lab up when I got there. So I'm the tree ring lab essentially. and and so I then got my first NSF grant in 1979, and I've been funded. And finally, I got on the faculty in 1989, and so it's really been 45 years or so, 50 years, doing tree rings in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and had a bunch of great students and colleagues come here and help me.
Mindy is interested, besides climate study, are there other big projects happening analyzing tree ring data? Do different species of trees in the same place give any different data?
Are there? Yeah. Well, I mean, of course, the whole thing about catastrophic wildfire, you know, so the history of fire is told in tree rings, and we can look at that for centuries. And we know that, while, okay, there's a lot of fire out in Western forests up until around 1880, 1900, when we brought in cattle and sheep and we started grazing, we ate down the fine fuels, and you know, and so shrubs started growing up, ladder fuels. Then we log the forest and we get advanced regeneration in the wake of logging. And so the forests that were open and park-like prior to all this grazing and logging have been drastically changed. And their flammability has completely changed. And we see that. And so fire scars disappear. Fires became less frequent because of these changes in the understory of our forest and the overstory. And we call it fire suppression, but that gives the idea that somebody went out and put the fires out. That's really not what happened. It's grazing that eliminated the fuels and logging that created more fuel. And now we're in this disequilibrium world. So yeah, we use that to study, we use tree rings to study fires. Um, there's some really wonderful work being done with radiocarbon dating and tree rings now. They are able to take minute samples of tree rings from one ring. 20 micrograms is all you need. And you can put it in a desktop mass spectrometer and you can measure radiocarbon. And we've done the royal we, I haven't done it, but the science has measured it for every year going back 1,000 years, a little bit more than 1,000 years. And we identify these big solar flares. They're not common, thank goodness. But these are so-called Miyake events that are these massive outbursts of solar energetic particles that will damage satellites in telecommunications and overload the electrical power grid in the United States and would be a tremendous disaster to our technological civilization. And I'm not exaggerating. There's a famous Carrington event in 1859, which is a solar flare, and it caused the northern lights to light up, as it were. And you could read the newspaper in Philadelphia by the light of the aurora borealis. You could read the newspaper in Delhi, India, all over the world. And so we know it was a massive solar flare, but it does not show up as a radiocarbon enrichment event, as a Miyake event. And so these ones that happened, I think in 1200 and 900 of the Common Era were massive events. And so fortunately they're rare, but we need to secure the grid against the potential recurrence of these things. And so there's lots of applications.
Alan goes back to the Amazon drought of 1865. And would one expect there may be extinctions of any of the fishes during such droughts?
Dang, I hadn't thought of that, I mean, I didn't, I wonder about the habitat area of these fishes. I've been to the fish markets in Manaus and Santorini, and man, those are the most amazing places in the world. They're outdoors, but with covers, and you got all these hundreds of different species of fish that are for sale, to eat, and real pretty, and yeah, I imagine they would have suffered extinction for some of more locally distributed species. The reason it's called the Forgotten Drought is because it happened in 1865. And, that's known to us as the last year of the Civil War. And, uh, the cotton prices were incredibly inflated. And so they grew cotton in Brazil at the time. And cotton is one of the more drought resistant of crops. And so they made bank selling cotton on the global market. And the consequences of the drought economically were not as great thanks to the American Civil War and a bunch of hothead Confederates that wanted to continue enslaving people. Get out of here. Can we please put that behind us? But yeah, isn't that amazing? So there hasn't been so much historical attention paid to the drought in Brazil in 1865 because everyone in Brazil was happy because they were making money. So anyway, boy.
That that's so interesting. There's a couple of questions in here. Do you collaborate with those who date very old structures by the wood they're constructed with? And Shireen says, can you give an example of how dendrochronology is used in archaeology? So I don't know if there's any crossover there.
Oh, heck yeah. And I've done a lot of that myself. We've dated, well, of course, we go to old log buildings or historical buildings and we take core samples. In fact, we have core samples from the trusses that hold the Liberty Bell in Independence Hall in downtown Pennsylvania. Get out, the birthplace of American democracy. There's white oak. They made those great buildings in Philadelphia out of white oak, mostly from the Delaware River Valley. And with the few living trees that are left and these historical timbers in Philadelphia, my friends have put together a 600-year-long white oak chronology for the Delaware River Valley. And these were timbers cut from the then virgin forest, right, in the late 16, early 1700s. So, oh yeah, historical buildings are super valuable. Of course, the most famous application of tree rings was by Andrew Ellicott Douglas in the southwestern United States, where he invented the dating method. He wanted to use it to study climate and look for solar effects on climate. And the archaeologists approached him, hey, we've got these archaeological sites that have vigas and other wood that are preserved in the ruins. And could you date them? And so, in fact, the answer was yes. And it took him about 10 years to build a long master chronology from living trees and extended far back 1,000 years to overlap in time with the occupation at Cliff Palace in Mesa Verde, for example, or um, Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon. And then he was able to cross match the timbers from Pueblo Bonito against the master chronology and assign calendar year dates to each ring and determine the year in which those trees were cut. And we know they were cut by humans because they have stone axe marks on the end. And I'll have you know that Stone axe marks leave a forensic pattern that's completely different than a metal axe. And so there's no doubt that the agent of death was a human that cut that tree. We now know exactly when that human cut that tree. And so that's part of the construction of these romantic ruins in the American Southwest. And yeah, I mean, the kinds of scientific questions that archaeologists and anthropological questions that archaeologists are able to address with such precise time control are really amazing.
Richard has a couple of questions on fire. Were historic forest fires that you discussed due to humans or just random natural cause, maybe lightning? And can you deduce whether a tree was burned in a forest fire from its rings?
Yes. Well, if it's burned completely up, no, of course. But if it was damaged, and a cat face forms at the base of the tree, and then the callus response, then you can determine the exact year when that fire scorched that tree. You bet. And my buddies at Tucson and other institutions around the country have done this a lot. And they've shown in the Mogollon Rim of Arizona and the greater Southwest in general that fires happened in pre-settlement times. I mean, during the occupations by native peoples, yes. And so, uh, but so you had both anthropogenic source for fire in pre-settlement times, and the dominant source was probably lightning. Because I mean, come on, the monsoon. You had a lot of lightning too, and so um, it turns out that fire was modulated by the El Nino Southern Oscillation in Arizona and New Mexico, because an El Nino event brings wetness and that favors the grasslands and they grow thick. And then when a La Nina event occurs, it brings drought to the Southwest, and so those thick grasses are then become flammable fuels. And so the pacing, as it were, of landscape, large scale, southwestern scale fire was modulated by climate out of the tropical Pacific, if you can believe that. It's an amazing study that was published in Science magazine, no doubt about it. So yeah, a lot of, and then the great studies have been done with giant sequoia. So many interesting studies have been done. Peter Brown, in Colorado State University, um, Tom Swetnam at the University of Arizona, and many others have done this kind of work.
What about petrified wood? Can you do rings out of petrified wood?
Rarely, yes, rarely, mostly not. But some of the, going back to what we were saying earlier about volcanic events, um, so some of this petrified wood is absolutely contemporaneous, like meaning that it was a forest that was entombed by a lahar of a volcanic avalanche. And so all the trees were immediately buried and killed and then permineralized and fossilized. And if that's the case, you can get, and there's some beautiful fossil wood deposits around the United States and around the world that fit that description. And the Sweet Home Formation in Oregon, for example, it's an oak, an ancestral oak, and Ed Wright has been able to cross, and some of them are 200 to 400-year-old trees that were entombed and fossilized, and they cross match with each other you know? And so it proved that they were contemporaneous. Now, it's millions of years ago, so it's not like we can do a big climate reconstruction or anything like that. It's just sort of a curiosity.
All right, and Alan has his hand up.
So before I ask my standard question, in that map with the 1931 to 1940 drought, the two dots on both maps in the southern New Mexico, the wet spots, were just, I mean, the correlation was almost like exactly the same in terms of where they were. That blew me away. But here's my standard question, David. Like going back as far as whenever childhood or high school or college, what got you interested in doing this for your life?
Well, when I lived in Northern Virginia, I was in college. I was going to school in Texas, and I went home. My parents were stationed in Northern Virginia, and I went home and I got a job. I was 18 years old, and I worked for a carpenter, and I love that. And working with wood, and I'm interested in archaeology. I went to school then at University of New Mexico in Albuquerque, and Professor Frank Hibben, who was an intellectual fraud but a wonderful lecturer and so forth, lectured on and on about tree ring dating, and oh, I love that. And my cousin Barney T was in Tucson working in the tree ring lab, so I transferred to Tucson. And yeah, and then when I got there, I was an undergraduate, and Marvin Stokes was one of the professors, and he hired me. I was working in a restaurant, and they took pity on me, and they gave me a job, and I did apparently adequate, and they invited me to go on an expedition with them to northern Mexico. They got an NSF grant to study the Jesuit and Franciscan era missionary churches to New Spain that were built in the 16th and 17th century in the Sierra Madre Occidental. And man, that changed my life. That was so much fun. We went down there in a big four-wheel drive Suburban for like 3 weeks on end, camping out in the high Sierra, and going and coring living trees and going to these beautiful churches and studying the Vigas and so forth. And so my path was set. That's how I arrived where I'm at. Thank you for the question.
Thanks so much. And the passion came through tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions tonight for Dr. Stahle?
Just want to say I really enjoyed your presentation. I really love it. And tree ring dating always fascinated me too. I'm into climatology and paleoclimatology too as a hobby. I'm not in it professionally, but I'm retired now, and that's what I'm hoping to play with in my own research while I'm retired.
Well, this whole Zoom thing, I so much enjoy meeting people and talking to them. And, this is a sad, I mean, this was great during COVID, and it would be very difficult for me to come to Maryland to give this. So, this is pretty good, it's really good. And, but I'm very sorry I'm not there in person to meet you. And thank you very much for the question and comments.
I just thought this presentation was terrific. I don't know much about the subject matter, and you got me impassioned.
Trees. Well, who doesn't like trees? Come on. A lot.
Do you know anybody in Maryland that has doing tree coring and?
Well, I do know a young lady that's at the University of Tennessee. Her name is Karen King, and she is from Maryland. And oh, dang it, she is wonderful. Karen King, she's an assistant professor in the Department of Geography at the University of Tennessee at Knoxville. And she is doing world-class work all over the country. And she started in Frostburg State. Isn't that in Maryland? Frostburg State?
That's in Western Maryland.
Yeah, I believe
Yeah.
she's from that area, and she started there. And I can't remember if she got her master's there. She ended up getting her PhD in Idaho, but she is really the real deal. And I think her family still lives in the area, and you must talk to her because she's done a lot of work with fire. She was a wildland firefighter herself, and so she's ripped, and she can don't get in a fight with her. And she's also doing these really great continent-wide reconstructions of temperature, from tree rings using completely new technology and so forth. So if you could possibly get a hold of her, I'm sure she'd be very interesting.
Oh, I definitely have her on my list.
Aaron
now.
King, easy to remember.
Great.
And there's
Thank
probably
you.
others I'm not thinking of right now. Mike Evans is a climatologist at the University of Maryland, and he knows all about paleoclimatology and modern climatology, El Nino Southern Oscillation. Michael Evans, he's a professor at the University of Maryland. And he
I-
was at the tree ring lab in Tucson for 5 or 10 years, and he's done a lot of interesting work with isotope geochemistry from the tree rings, which is a whole thing I didn't get into. And so, yeah, talk to Mike.
Well, we're going to have a field trip out to the tree ring lab out at Fayetteville and come visit.
Anytime, anytime.
Well, thank you all for joining us tonight for Must Learn Thursday. And thank you, Dr. Stahle, for spending so much time with us and making us smarter. And then, yes, we have good luck fighting the anarchist as well down there in a chat. So
Thank you so much. I appreciate the honor to be able to talk to you.
all right, everybody stay well, stay curious, stay
Okay.
outside.
Okay.
See y'all
Take
next
care.
week. Take care. Bye-bye.
Take care.